It's the end of the 2023 F1 season, which means it's time for me to rank the drivers in a tier list. So, as is tradition, I have the categories of Max, standout, good, inconsistent, mid, and bad. I will go through and rank all the drivers on here, depending on their categories, and then at the end of the video, I will show you how my ranking of them has changed since the start of the year, which is something that I find quite interesting. Let's get started. First up, we have Sergio Perez, and honestly, for me, Sergio's going in bad. Yeah, it was a rough one for Sergio. Sergio won 2 races at the start of the season. And honestly, I think after 4 races, we were all really feeling like Sergio might be able to put up a title fight for the full year. But then Max just decided to turn on another gear and didn't lose any race except one for the rest of the year. And Sergio struggled so much. And in the best car in F1 history, the fact that he only got 2 wins is just unacceptable. Also the fact that he consistently didn't make Q3, but it wasn't just that. I think if Sergio had managed to finish on the podium more often and had been a respectable second driver to Max, I think I would have put him higher up. But it's the fact that he rarely finished P2 this year. His racecraft was absolutely brutal for a lot of the year. And the fact that Max ended up on the season with more than double the points that he had. And in a car that good, it just isn't good enough. Sergio did have some good races. I thought his best races this year were Saudi Arabia and Azerbaijan, which were both of the races that he won. Baku in particular was the only race that I feel like he actually beat Max on pace. His worst races include Monaco, where he crashed in Q1 and started P20 on the hardest track to pass. And then in the race was just driving so terribly to try and make up positions. And then there was Japan, where he did his whole crash into Magnussen, DNF, un-DNF to serve his 5-second penalty, and then DNF again, which gotta be so embarrassing. Like, to un-DNF yourself, would not want to be you. And then there was that stretch of 5 straight races where he didn't make Q3. God, Sergio. And then, of course, at the end of the year, just when he seemed like he was redeeming himself, he got pipped on the last lap in both Brazil and Las Vegas for a higher podium position. He should have done so much better in that car, and it's very disappointing that he didn't. Some strengths and weaknesses this year for Sergio. I thought Sergio was good at battling back from the poor qualifying positions. He did a lot of like P10 to P4, P9 to P5, that kind of performance, but Sergio's always been a better driver on a Sunday than a Saturday, but when you're in a car that good, you should be qualifying higher than he did. And then his weaknesses are, as mentioned, poor racecraft. He let the pressure get to him in qualifying with a lot of track limits issues, and that also came in from the fact that he was pushing too hard to try and be Max instead of just knowing his own limit and driving within it. So yeah, Max just completely obliterated him. Sergio went from a title hopeful after 4 races to people calling for his seat by the summer break. So that was about how Sergio's season went. So for me, given the car he had, he is in the bad category this year. Next up is Pierre Gasly. And for me, Pierre is actually going in good. I thought that Pierre did very well for his first year at a new team. The first half of the year was a little bit rough for him, but a lot of that was team communication issues and bad luck. And I think as the season went on, he got a lot stronger. Pierre has kind of proven himself to be a very good qualifier, but would consistently get screwed over by his team strategy calls and a lack of communication. Yeah, those impeding penalties, especially I think at Spain where he got 2 in one session, was brutal. And one thing we'll see later when I get to Esteban is that I think Pierre just had less bad races than Esteban did this year. Both of them had the same number of good races, but I think Pierre had less bad races, which is surprising because I generally consider Pierre to be much more of like a peak and valley kind of driver and Esteban to be a lot more consistent, but I think this year it was almost swapped. Pierre's best races, I have Bahrain. Honestly, could not tell you what happened in that race, but he qualified P20 and ended up P9, so I think he must have done pretty well. I also have his sprint race performance at Belgium because he got P3 in tricky conditions, which is a trend that I have noticed with Pierre. And then obviously his best performance was the Dutch GP, where he miraculously managed to put that car into P3. I still don't understand how this happened. I think they just made the right strategy call at every single turn and just happened to put him on the podium, which insane in that Alpine. That was not a good car this year. His worst race was definitely Australia, where he was doing so well. And then that last red flag restart just went a bit too hard into that first corner, went off the track, came back on and crashed into his teammate, which is the cardinal rule of F1, is you never crash into your teammate. So that was very, very poor and unfortunate. I'm surprised there wasn't a civil war at Alpine after that, honestly. So yes, as mentioned, Pierre's strengths is his qualifying. He has the odd Gaporsly or G5ly or 6-assly. And one thing I did notice this year with Pierre is that Alpine really seemed to favor Esteban with the strategy. Now, I don't know if it was because they actually had given Pierre what they thought had been the optimum strategy, but then it turns out that the optimum strategy was actually the strategy they gave Esteban, or if it was on purpose and they were favoring Esteban this year. But it just seemed like anytime that Gasly would qualify like P4 or P5, Esteban would be way at the back and somehow would undercut him. So I think Alpine need to do some thinking on that one. But yes, his teammate, they sure love to complain about each other on the radio. Ocon's pettiness is in his actions, Gasly's is in his words. And it makes for a very chaotic, interesting duo. So I'm excited to see where that goes next year. And then I would say for Gasly, like one of his weaknesses is his tire management. He's not as good at it at the end of his stint, and I think that's also part of the reason why he would tend to drop back during the races, while Esteban would make progress upwards. So I think that's something Gasly still has to work on. Speaking of Esteban, he's up next, and I have him in inconsistent. Esteban this year had a few absolutely incredible races, and then he had some that could only be described as embarrassing. And yeah, at some points this year, he seemed more concerned with what was going on with Gasly or with Alonso than playing the team game or trying to improve his own position. He's very, very petty. And it's very funny and very entertaining, but I don't know how useful it is as an attribute. But yes, his best races, I definitely would say Monaco, where he managed to podium in what is essentially his home race now. And that qualifying performance was very impressive from him. I wasn't expecting that from Esteban. He's not really a driver that you typically associate with really good qualifying, so that was interesting to see. I think Belgium was also a really strong race for him. He made a lot of really impressive moves in that race. And then Vegas as well. He did get a little bit lucky at the start because he qualified not that well, but managed to battle through all of the chaos at the start to end up P4. So also very impressive. Now for his worst races. And there are two that come to mind, and I feel like you all know which two I'm going to mention, and that is Bahrain and Austria. Bahrain, the number of different penalties this man managed to come up with is truly flabbergasting. He had the incorrect starting position at the start, went in to serve his penalty, served that incorrectly, and then spit in the pit lane. So, 3 different penalties, which tied the record set by Pastor Maldonado. Or did it beat it? I can't even remember. I feel like the record was 3, so I think he tied it at that point. And then, in Austria, managed to one-up himself when he accumulated 30 seconds of track limit penalties. But, like, the funniest thing about this was the fact that, like, a lot of other drivers were getting warnings because the FIA was paying attention to them. But Alpine is just so irrelevant for everyone that they weren't giving them any warnings. And so Esteban at the end of the race had a radio where his team engineer told him, like, good job avoiding track limits issues. And he's like, yeah, we managed to do a good job at that. JK, 30 seconds of penalties. It was so funny. Oh my god. Just two absolutely embarrassing races for him. I'm curious to know what the record for penalties in a single season is. Although I think he managed to avoid penalties in a lot of other races, so maybe he wouldn't have set the record there, but still very, very funny. He had a lot of DNFs this year, but the vast majority of them were either a mechanical issue or a crash that wasn't his fault. Esteban also doesn't have the best quality pace at times. And in comparison to Gasly, as I said earlier, he's a weaker qualifier than Gasly. He's better at tire management than Gasly. But all in all, they're very close on points of performance. They are probably one of the closest pairs on the grid. So very interesting to see where they'll go from there. All right, next up is Valtteri Bottas. And for me, Valtteri's going in mid. I think Valtteri just had a very anonymous year this year. He had a couple strong performances, and those strong performances were at a level that was above what Zhou was able to reach, but really there was only a few races this year where that car was capable of anything. Valtteri was relatively close to Zhou points-wise, but especially towards the end of the year, I think he still just has quite a bit more pace than his teammate. Valtteri's best races were Bahrain and Qatar, where he finished P8 at both of them. Bahrain is just a race that Bottas is really good at. He always does well there. And I think Alfa Romeo were just good at the hot racetracks this year and all of the ones in the Middle East for some reason. So they need to find out why that is, because anytime the track was colder, they just struggled a lot more. And yeah, Qatar just managed to do a good job to tolerate the harsh conditions. So his worst races were Spain, where he finished P19 in a race that Zhou actually finished in the points. So I'm not really sure why he was outperformed so much by his teammate there, but definitely a weaker race for him. And then Abu Dhabi, where he was lapped and just absolutely nowhere that race. But I think part of that was just a really bad strategy call. Valtteri's strengths are that he's very good at qualifying when the car is working for him, and he's a very good team player. But his weaknesses are that he is truly the worst on the grid at defending. And it's really funny, like, if you look back at all of those Daniel Ricciardo overtakes that he did over the course of his career and some of those big wins he had, almost every single time he would have a massive dive bomb on Valtteri Bottas. It's always Bottas because he doesn't know how to defend. And it's kind of funny. And another weakness for Valtteri is that he is very anonymous a lot of the time, but I think that is just Alfa Romeo's fault. Honestly, that team has been nowhere for a very long time. And yes, compared to his teammate, I think he still has a bit more quali pace and a bit more race pace, although they are fairly close. And I think Valtteri benefits a lot from experience. And speaking of, I have Zhou Guanyu just behind Valtteri. And similarly, Zhou was also very anonymous this year, and I think he had a couple good races, but he just doesn't really stand out for a good or a bad reason. His best races were through the three races that he finished P9 in, which were Australia, Spain, and Qatar. Australia, he just managed to stay out of trouble, and he did finish ahead of Valtteri in that race as well, because I think Valtteri was one of the few drivers who finished outside the points in that race, so Zhou did a good job there. Spain, I remember Zhou just having a lot of pace that weekend. I don't really know why. Maybe it's just a track that he's really comfortable at. He had some good battles with Yuki and was doing a lot of overtakes, and I think he just had a good race weekend that weekend. And then Qatar, I think Alfa Romeo had a really good strategy that race, and he started from P19 and managed to finish P9. And then his worst race was unfortunately Hungary. He qualified incredibly well, his best of his career at P5 in that race. And although it was mainly due to an issue in the car, he stalled at the start and then crashed into the back of Daniel Ricciardo and ended up finishing P16 in that race. And that poor start also impacted Valtteri as well, which was so unfortunate for them when they finally had a race where they qualified well and they weren't able to capitalize. Some of Zhou's strengths, he's able to stay in track limits. He was one of the few drivers who didn't get any track limit warnings in Austria. And I don't recall any time this year where he actually got a penalty for that. He's very good at keeping it within the lines. That could be an indication, though, that he isn't pushing the car as much as he could. That's one of his weaknesses, is that he lacks pace. He's also a very consistent driver who doesn't make many mistakes. But again, this also means that he's anonymous. He doesn't do anything super good, but he doesn't do anything super bad either, which I suppose is something that you would maybe want in a driver, but it also might not be the best for marketing. So he was fairly close to Valtteri. I think pace-wise, there is something to be desired there. Next up is Nico Hülkenberg. And I have Nico in inconsistent with Esteban. This isn't really anything to do with Nico, though, really. I think Nico did a fantastic job of pulling out some incredible qualifying performances in that car. And when the track was one that had low tire drag, he was able to perform. But that Haas was such a bad car that it was really tough to tell how well Nico was actually driving in it, because it would just fall back in the race and you couldn't do anything about it. So it's just tough to tell what he was really doing in that car. I will never forget that 10-minute time period where we all thought that Nico had a podium in Australia. It was so exciting. We were all so happy for him and hoping that it would be true. But then it was snatched away from him because if the FIA had called that red flag 10 seconds later, they would have all made it through Sector 1, and then we would have had absolute pandemonium in terms of results in that race. But yeah, it'd just be like that sometimes. But he did manage to capitalize in Australia and finish P7, and it was definitely one of his best races. And then the only other race that he got points was in Austria, but that was a sprint race. He was very much on the pace that day and made a great strategy call in the wet to change tires and was able to get, I think he got a P5 in that race, P6. Maybe P6. And yeah, just managed to do a really good job there. His worst races, I have Las Vegas here. I just remember him having a tough time in that race. But honestly, it was just really tough to tell what races were actually him and which races were actually the car. And I feel like his teammate had a few more races that were Kevin's fault than Nico having bad races that were Nico's fault. So yeah, I think Nico's strengths are that he's a fantastic qualifier, and that is proven in the fact that at one point this year he had more Q3 appearances than Checo did in the Red Bull. Wild stat. And then Nico's weaknesses are sometimes it seems like his race pace and racecraft isn't as strong as his quali pace, but that's mainly the tires, I think. And sometimes he pushes too hard for a good result and screws it up, as is the case with nearly every single time that he's ever been close to getting a podium, and he's managed to screw it up. Hockenheim. But yes, a better qualifier than Kevin, but seemed to get outperformed in races. So Kevin, unfortunately, Kevin is going in bad. He was just nowhere all year, and just consistently outqualified by his teammate. Didn't really have any standout performances. Apart from maybe Miami, I feel like Miami was a pretty good race for him. I remember him battling with Leclerc for a lot of that race, which is a good sign for a Haas car. And yeah, I think he won everyone Chipotle in that race too, so I feel like everyone appreciated that. I think he only got 3 points this year, all P10 finishes. So there was that one in Miami. He had Saudi Arabia, where he took advantage of low tire drag and good strategy, and then Singapore as well, which I think is one of his really good tracks because he does have the lap record there from the old layout. So, which is a wild thing. How did that happen? Who knows? Miami and Singapore, the reason why he was able to get points, he actually qualified well, which I think kind of shows you with Nico where he's lacking his racecraft, is that when Kevin was actually able to qualify well, he was able to hang on, whereas Nico seemed to fall back when he was able to qualify well. So interesting to think about there. But Kevin's worst races were Australia and Abu Dhabi. Australia, I think he was on for a decent performance, like maybe wouldn't have gotten to the points, but he was kind of close to the points, so who knows what else could have happened in that race. But he DNF'd in that because he crashed into the wall. And then Abu Dhabi, he was just absolutely nowhere that race and finished last. So never something you want to see. But yeah, just poor showing in qualifying compared to his teammate and needlessly aggressive sometimes. Although he was better at that this year than he was last year. He didn't lose as many front wings. Next up, we have Alex Albon. And Albano is my first driver going into standout. Albon impressed me so much in 2023. On weekends where the Williams car was actually good, he was able to capitalize almost every single time. The only race he didn't, which was his worst performance of the year, was Australia, where he was running in P6. He had qualified incredibly well in that race, but unfortunately made a mistake and crashed into the wall. But then he had races like Canada, which is one that I saw in person, where he hung on the entire race on that set of tires and was like 40 seconds behind Checo. But he managed to keep so many cars behind him because of that straight line speed. And that was so impressive to watch. And then he also did well at the Dutch GP, which was a very surprising track for them to have been good at. And Britain as well. Kind of same thing. Just very surprised that they were good at that track. And finished P8 in both of those races. And then Monza, of course, which was the one race everyone was expecting the Williams to be good at. They were good. Alex capitalized. His teammate did not. So that tells you what makes Albon good. He was able to handle the pressure of that weekend. His strengths, he just completely dominated his teammate in qualifying, and he became the new tire whisperer this year. I think that is a title that he has stolen from Checo Perez. His weaknesses are the fact that we can't really truly know how good of a driver he is. One, because of who his teammate is, and two, because we just don't really know how good that Williams car is. Is it a bad car that's on Logan's level and Albon is vastly outperforming it? Or is it a car that is actually better than Albon and Albon hasn't been able to get it out of it? You just truly don't know. Although that could be the case in any car, really. I sometimes find that Albon is also, he's such a nice guy that sometimes he isn't quite aggressive enough in situations where he could be a little bit more aggressive. And so that can sometimes cost him. But yeah, just absolutely obliterated his teammate and capitalized almost every single time that car was good. And so that's why I have him in standout this year. Logan, on the other hand, is my worst driver of the year. He's going in the bad category. He was just significantly outperformed by Albon and won this year's Destructors Championship because he crashed a lot, which is very, very surprising that Williams kept him on. But honestly, I feel like the reason he would is the only other people who were really available were other rookies, and then they're just going to have to go through the exact same things again anyways. So you may as well stick with someone who's already gone through a lot of those growing pains and see if they are a better driver because of it than to go back to start with someone new. And yeah, he just barely held on to his fifth one seat. Logan's best races this year. I went with Bahrain, his first one. I feel like Logan really just got in his own head about things, and I think he might have been thinking a bit too much. And I feel like this was also exemplified in his performance in Qatar. I know he DNF'd, but I have this race down as one of his best of the year because he was doing so well in that race, even though he felt so ill. And I think it was because he was so focused on how sick he was feeling that he was driving based on instinct. And then I think he was doing better as a result. That's how I feel about it. So I think Logan needs to shut all that off and not think so analytically and just drive based on instinct and drive based on how he knows how to. And I think he'll improve his performances if he's able to do that. And then I also have Coda, where he got his first points. Although he did need 2 disqualifications for that to happen, but I think it was still a good race, and P12 would have been a good finish for him too. And then his worst races, I have Monaco, where he got passed by a lot of drivers, which is not something that should happen in Monaco. And he also just ended up using that race as a test session for tire management. James Vowles put him on soft and he's like, have at her, boy, you gotta figure it out. So I think that was smart, actually, on their part, to kind of know he's not getting points here. We may as well utilize this to kind of help him improve as a driver. So, but it's still kind of embarrassing that they had to do that for him. I also have the Dutch GP, where he qualified well and managed to get into Q3, but then crashed in Q3 and then crashed in the race as well, which I think partially wasn't his fault. I think there was a failure to crash twice in the same weekend is never a good sign. And then I also have Japan as well, where he crashed in qualifying and then took out Bottas in the race. So yeah, as mentioned, I think his strengths are when he can pull it all together, he can be on Albon's pace. And he had a few decent qualifying results, although he never managed to qualify ahead of Albon. And he does have the strength of America behind him, and you can never count that out. His weaknesses are that he was a rookie, so he didn't really know a lot of tracks. He got into his own head a lot, especially after Saudi Arabia qualifying, where he lost out because of track limits on the one track that he might have actually out-qualified Albon. He's also very crash prone and just could never put a full weekend together. So he needs to figure that out for next year, because I think if he is obliterated again by Alex, then I think he's done. Next up is AlphaTauri, and Yuki Tsunoda, I'm putting in good, just ahead of his former teammate. This might be a bit high compared to other people, but I think with the amount of things that Yuki had to deal with at that team this year, I think he did a very good job. He had to become a team leader after Pierre left and managed to destroy De Vries' career. He was on about the same level as Liam Lawson, and then I would say slightly outperformed Daniel Ricciardo, although Daniel did have a lot of things going on for him too, which we'll get to later. Honestly, I do think that Yuki saved his F1 seat this year. I think after last year, I was like, this man is on his last legs, and if he doesn't figure stuff out quickly, he's going to be out. And he managed to figure things out quickly, and it was very impressive. Especially at the start of this year, when he was consistently finishing either P10 or P11 every single race. And it was very sad, because we all wanted Yuki to do well, and those P11 finishes are rough. And then once the car got better at the end of the year, he did step up. He got more points than every driver that he was up against. So good for Yuki. So his best races, I have Baku, where it's a track that him and AlphaTauri are good at. And it's a race where I think people started to question Nick De Vries' career. And I think Yuki finished in the points there. I also have Brazil, where I think he benefited from having Daniel kind of rear guard him, being a lap down, but he did well to finish in the points there, and he had some good pace. And then Abu Dhabi as well, where is another track that just really suits him. And I think if he had gone on a different strategy, it might have gone a little bit better for him, but he did well to hang on and make the most of it. His worst races, I have Austria, where I don't really remember what happened to him, but he only finished P19, so I'm assuming something must have gone badly. I watched all the highlights for the races, but they never really show what happens to the drivers at the back, so I don't really know, and I just don't have the time to rewatch the whole race. And then I also have Mexico, where he was doing very, very well, but was a bit impatient, and the old Yuki kind of came out, and he crashed into Piastri and got knocked out of the points, which I think ultimately might have cost AlphaTauri P7 in the championship, which is unfortunate. But yes, Yuki's strengths. On his day, he can be really, really quick. He can be a very fast qualifier and is very fast in race pace when the car is suiting him. As he gets more and more comfortable in F1, I think he's only going to get better. And I just love that he's a chaotic ball of energy. He is so entertaining and such a good marketing tool for Red Bull, because he just seems to constantly be hyped up on energy, which is exactly what they're looking for. His weaknesses, I think he's still quick to anger and gets impatient if things aren't going his way. This was something that happened in Mexico, but I think he was definitely better with this year than his previous 2 years. And similarly, he sometimes throws away a good result, which, again, Mexico, but that happened way more often in the past 2 years. I also feel like Yuki has to improve on technical feedback. Something that he said a lot this year is that Nick De Vries came in and really gave a lot of good technical feedback. And then he also said that Daniel Ricciardo had a lot of good feedback that were able to make the car perform so well in Mexico and beyond. And I think it was good that they provided those inputs, but all it's also doing is saying Yuki didn't have the experience or the knowledge to provide that feedback. And so I think that's something that he needs to work on, is either how to communicate that to his team or to kind of see what are good setups in F1. But yes, like either outperformed or similar level to all three of his teammates this year. And so the fact that he was able to make his way through all that turmoil was very impressive. Okay, next up, it's my boy. It's Daniel Ricciardo. He's going in inconsistent behind Nico. I am a Daniel girly. You all know this. But even I have to be honest, and I think Daniel had a lot of things go against him this year, but Mexico was his only really, really good performance. So that was tough to swallow. But honestly, I don't really feel like we had enough data points to really analyze how he's doing, and I think that's probably a big reason why Red Bull didn't end up swapping him and Checo. I feel like that might have been their plan if Daniel hadn't gotten injured, but life just be like that. So yes, but the times that he was able to show it, specifically Mexico, and then even when he was driving a lap down in Brazil, he did have very, very good pace and was close to Max on pace when he was able to show it in clean air. But yeah, the amount of bad luck that Daniel had this year could probably match Charles Leclerc. He got hit from behind in Hungary by Joe and was knocked to the back and was able to do quite well on a long stint to try and make up spaces, but couldn't get into the points. Zandvoort, he injured himself avoiding a crash with Oscar. And then coming back from injury in the US, which was his worst performance, a big part of that was the fact that his brake duct randomly broke. And then in Brazil, he just got hit by this tire flying from the air and just happened to hit the most breakable part of his car. So, and then he was down a lap because the FIA wouldn't allow him to unlap themselves. So, what are you gonna do? And then Abu Dhabi, he got a tear off stuck in his brake duct. So, literally every race, there was something. And I'm so mad about it. His best race, obviously Mexico. Mexico. He was a 10th off Max in qualifying in a AlphaTauri, and he still outqualified Checo as well. So if he can figure out what is going on in Mexico and replicate that at every single other track, it would be golden. But this track, I don't know what it is about it. I think he must have a few tricks to it, but he's just so good there. He was good there both years in McLaren. It was his one good race in 2022. But he's just magic there. And then Brazil as well, I have down as one of his good races, just because he had really good race pace, and without the FIA making him go a lap down, I feel like he probably could have finished in the points in that race. His worst races, I have Belgium. I feel like that was the race before he was injured where Yuki really outperformed him. And yeah, I think he did well on the sprint day that day, but I think he was a little bit rusty. Got knocked out in qualifying, and then just wasn't able to do much in the race. And then Las Vegas, I think that car just didn't really have the pace, and so Daniel was kind of anonymous that weekend. Strengths, I think Daniel is very, very strong at race pace. He was always getting compared to Max in his radio messages with his engineer, and they were always saying, yeah, you're a few tenths off Max in terms of race pace, so I think that's a good sign. He's also very good at giving good technical feedback, and I think that comes with experience, and that completely turned the car around. They were able to set it up in a way that he liked, but also worked better than what Yuki was giving the team. And then obviously Daniel's winning personality is one of his strengths, because it's why everyone loves him so much. Daniel's weaknesses, I have his horrendous luck with just all of those issues he had. I think he was a little bit rusty and maybe a bit out of shape after his injury, which is just unfortunate. And I honestly just feel like he didn't have enough races to really show what he can do at this point in his career. But I feel like all of his races were better than 90% of his time at McLaren. So I think he's on the up and up. I think he's not as washed of a driver as some people think he is, but I think Daniel just needs a standard full F1 season to show everybody what he's got, and that he's still got it. I do think that injury did impact his performance a bit, and I think is a large part of the reason why Yuki outperformed him at almost every race except Mexico after coming back. Okay, next up I have my other boy. It's Charles Leclerc, and he's going in standout right behind Alex Albon. Now, the reason why I have him behind Alex is I do think that Charles made a few more mistakes this year than Alex did. And I think what Alex was able to do in it as terrible a car as the Williams is, I think was just a little bit more impressive to me than what Charles was able to do in that Ferrari. But I think towards the end of the year, it definitely got close, and it was a very close toss-up between these two for me. But yes, Charles had a really tough start to the year with his typical bad luck. But at the end of the year, once they had upgraded the car and it was a podium contender, he performed incredibly well. And as I mentioned, I think he still has a few mistakes to iron out, but I don't think anyone can beat Charles in terms of qualifying pace. And if he eventually gets a car that is on his level, the world better watch out, because he's going to be a dangerous, dangerous man. Charles's best races, first one that comes to mind for me is Baku, where he's just a god there. There's no other way to put it. He qualified P1 in both of the qualifying sessions this year, ahead of that Red Bull in the unupgraded Ferrari car. And yeah, he managed to finish on a podium in both the sprint and the Grand Prix. Another strong performance from him was Las Vegas, obviously, which I think is a race he should have won, if not for that safety car that came out. And honestly was the only race all year where there was someone on the Red Bull's level in race pace by merit, which is wild. I think that Ferrari has definitely made some steps at the end of this year, and so I'm very curious to see where they will take it next year. And then we have Abu Dhabi, which I think in the grand scheme of things, there wasn't anything that Charles really had to do in that race that made it good, but I think the thing about this race that impressed me was him being strategic at the end of the race and letting Checo by in order to try and build a 5-second gap to Russell behind so that Ferrari could get P2 in the championship. I think this is the first time that we've really seen Charles think in this way, or at least the first time we've seen it broadcast. And it's one of the things that I've been wanting Charles to work on. And so the fact that he's done that and had these thoughts in the race was really, really encouraging. And I think is something that if he's able to implement that a little bit more, I think that'll really improve him as a driver. And so I was very glad to see that. And so I thought that was something that made that race a good race for him. Plus he finished P2. So, and then the worst race is Spain. I still don't know why he was so bad at Spain. I don't think he knows why he was so bad at Spain. He qualified P19, which I honestly don't even think was something he did in an Alfa Romeo when he was there. Wild. Very, very wild. And yeah, he managed to make his way only back to P11 in the race. It was his only race this year that he classified that he didn't get points in. His other bad races, Australia, where he collided with Lance on the first lap and got beached in the gravel. So that was the end of that one. And Miami, where he crashed twice in the exact same place in qualifying and in practice. And then in the race itself had no pace and was stuck behind Haas for half the race, which is not something that you want to be said in a Ferrari. Other than that, Charles had a pretty good season, I would say. Charles's strengths, he is easily the best qualifier on the grid, frequently putting that car where it doesn't belong. He had a lot of poles this year in a not very good Ferrari, so if that Ferrari is ever good, I wouldn't be surprised if he could get pole the entire season through. Like, he is so incredible, and that pole to win ratio kills me every time I think about it, but it's always been things that are out of his control and his team's fault. It's rarely been Charles's fault that he's not converted on that. Yeah, from Belgium on, so after the summer break, every race he finished in the top 5, which is very impressive. And like I said earlier, the only person who was on Max's level in a race this year at that Las Vegas GP. His weaknesses, bro is the unluckiest person I have ever heard of. And the fact that he got a DNF, a DNS, and a DSQ in the same season is just, what does this man have to do to change his luck? Honestly, like, I'm just hoping that the gods are just piling all of this really bad luck all in like the first 5 seasons of his career so that the next 10 seasons or ever how long he still has in F1 just go so much smoother for him, because I feel so bad for him every time. But yes, he is, as I mentioned earlier, he is improving at it, but he does need to think a little bit more strategically in the races and take strategy into his own hands, because we all know that you can't trust Ferrari with that all the time. Although Ferrari was a little bit better at it this year. Sometimes he pushes the car too far past what it's capable of. But yeah, compared to Carlos, I think at the start of the year, he definitely struggled a lot more when the car was much more understeery and he wasn't really sure how to set it up properly that suited him. But once he figured that out and the car was upgraded, he significantly outperformed Carlos. And honestly, Charles just has the it factor that Carlos doesn't. And Carlos Sainz fans, I know that you like the guy, but I just feel like that's the truth, and so sorry. Speaking of Carlos, I have in good this year ahead of Yuki. As I mentioned earlier, I think Carlos outperformed Charles at the start of the year when the car wasn't that good, but it suited Carlos's style because Carlos likes a bit more understeer in his car. But as soon as the car got better and became a consistent podium contender, Charles started to outperform him consistently. Carlos definitely had a stretch of really good performances in the middle of the season, in particular Monza and Singapore, which I have down as his best races of the year. Singapore, obviously, I think was his best drive in F1. He showed masterful strategy to use Lando to keep the Mercs behind, and he also just controlled that race from start to finish, and it was such a good race to watch. Monza, he did well to keep Max, then Checo, then Charles behind him as best he could in that race, and almost made it to the end, but fortunately still only finished P3, but it was a good performance from him, who I think he also qualified on pole there. His worst races, I have Belgium, where he crashed into Oscar lap 1, and then blamed Oscar when it was primarily his own fault for locking up and having to avoid Lewis, which is still something that bothers me about Carlos. Also Australia, when he was running super well, and then took out Fernando on that restart, got a 5-second penalty, and because of the circumstances meant he was out of the points, which is very unfortunate and I think is something that the FIA does need to look at, but it is something that you need to consider on those last restarts, and he didn't, and it cost him significantly. And then also Abu Dhabi, where he crashed in FP2, and then his pace just completely disappeared. And he had a whack strategy from Ferrari, and then DNF'd on the last lap. So, very brutal race for that one. I would say Carlos's strengths are that he's a very intelligent driver who knows strategy better than Ferrari themselves. I often say that if you could combine Carlos's brain with Charles's skill, you would have the perfect F1 driver. And I think he can be fast when the car suits his style, but as soon as it doesn't, he isn't able to get as much out of it. And I think Carlos does play the political game very, very well, which I think is why things were kind of pushing in his direction development-wise for a little bit there. But as soon as Fred came in, Fred understood you cannot move away from Charles Leclerc in terms of your car design, because Fred understands that you need to support your best driver and not try to make a car that suits both. Because we've seen with Red Bull, you only need one driver to perform really well to win the constructors. And I think Ferrari have always been a team that prioritizes constructors over drivers, whereas Red Bull prioritizes drivers over constructors. And so I think that philosophy difference is why Red Bull also wins the constructors when Ferrari does not. So I think I'm glad that Fred's come in, and I think Fred understands that. And I think he's making the right changes. Weaknesses for Carlos, I think he's too quick to blame others for his own mistakes. We see this with his crash with Oscar, with impeding issues, with that penalty that he took. He was blaming the FIA instead of his own mistakes. And sometimes you just need to be able to fess up when you did something wrong, because it shows that you can grow as a driver if you can admit fault. I also think that Carlos constantly impedes, and it's a bit of a running joke in the F1 world that Carlos is always the one who's impeding people. And I think Daniel had a few quotes about it. Oscar has definitely gone off, and he is definitely not Carlos's biggest fan, which is very funny. Yeah, once the car is good, Carlos just can't keep up with Charles. Next up, I have Lewis Hamilton, and Lewis is going in standout. I think it's just so impressive that Lewis still managed to do well in a car that was just so bad, and a car that he just absolutely hated to drive, and yet still finished P3 ahead of that big clump of drivers that were only 5 points apart. I think it just shows you how good of a driver Lewis is that he finished P3 ahead of that Ferrari, which I would say was probably the second best car, because it just had a lot more really good performances this year than the Mercedes. I think Mercedes were a very consistent car throughout the year, but I think other teams, when they were in their window, would outperform the Mercedes and then drop below the Mercedes in other races. There were only a few races this year where I would say the Merc was the second best car. But I do have Lewis lower than a few other drivers that I'll get to later, mainly just because I feel like Lewis had a few more weak races this year than in previous seasons. Usually he's very good at being consistent all year, although I think part of that is the fact that since he didn't have a championship winning car, he didn't need to be as consistent as he usually is, and he was kind of locked into that P3 position, and there wasn't really much he was really working towards, especially at the end of the year. Lewis's best races, I have Spain, which is one of the few races where Merckx had that second best car and Lewis made the most of it and finished P2. There's also Singapore, where he probably would have won the race if he had been ahead of George. I don't think Lewis would have missed on an opportunity to win a race, and I think he would have known how to get past Lando, and then Carlos would have been easy pickings after that. So, a bit unfortunate for him, but it was a very, very good performance from him. And then the US GP, he had a really, really strong performance there, and then of course got disqualified. So unfortunate, but I think that was one of his better drives of the year because he was very close to winning that race. And his worst races, obviously Qatar, where he took out his teammate lap 1. Never a good thing to do in Formula 1, and yeah, that probably cost him P2 in the Drivers' Championship, along with that DSQ in the US. Another weak race for him was surprisingly Brazil. I think that was mainly down to setup issues because I think they went a little bit too conservative with it after the US GP. And the car was just nowhere that weekend. And Lewis was just anonymous, which is very rare for him, especially at that track that he loved so much. And then I also had Abu Dhabi, which I think just weirdly didn't have pace in qualifying. And then in the race, he crashed into the back of Pierre and took a lot of damage. And yeah, it was just a weird one. But I think at that point, he was kind of checked out and very worn out after a very tough stretch of races at the end of the year. Lewis's strengths are that he's extremely consistent, but consistent at a level that is better than anyone else is consistent, apart from probably Max. And he finished in the points in every single race that he finished, which I think he's the only driver to do that this year, apart from Max. And yeah, he still finished in a P3 in a car that wasn't great. And people like to say, oh, Lewis is only good because the car's been good, but even when the car hasn't been as good, he still managed to perform. And his weaknesses, I think Lewis is a driver that once he has achieved the objectives that he wants to achieve, he does tail off. He's not like Max where he's able to keep it going even when he's won everything. He kind of loses motivation when he doesn't have anything to fight for. So the last 3 races of the year were definitely a lot more rough than any other races of the year. And yeah, he just had a few more bad races than usual, which is a bit odd for him. But in terms of comparison to his teammate, he was equal to George on qualifying, but significantly outperformed him in the races, got way more good results, way more points, and yeah, George was struggling this year. And speaking of, I have him an inconsistent, just ahead of Bestie. Honestly, for George, I really could not tell you a single race this year where he had a very standout performance in a good way. He was just very invisible this year, apart from the odd, extremely funny radio message. George Russell has become a living meme, and he's not my favorite driver, but I can definitely appreciate that aspect of him. And he did have several bad races this year due to mistakes that cost him quite a bit of points, and I think that's probably why he finished so far behind his teammate this year. His best races were Spain, where he podiumed, and the car was good there, and he managed to capitalize, which is always good. Qatar, he was also very good because he got taken out lap 1 by his teammate, but managed to battle his way all the way back to P4. And then Abu Dhabi, where he got his second podium of the year. He qualified well and then managed to keep it clean and managed to stay within 5 seconds of Checo, keep that championship position for Mercedes. George's worst races, Canada, he went too fast over a curb and hit the wall and eventually had to retire, but he did provide the only moment of excitement in that race. So thank you, George, for making my first in-person race at least a little bit entertaining. Obviously, Singapore, where, oh, Georgie, he was having such a good race, but he completely bottled it at the end. He was following Lando too much and took a little bit too much of that wall that Lando clipped and was straight into the gap in Singapore. And I think all that race proved is just how much more he has to do to be on Lewis's level. I think Lewis would never, ever throw a win away like that. And George needs to look at himself a little bit in the mirror and think about how he can improve in that situation. And then Brazil as well for him was a tough one. I think it was mainly car setup, but he was just dropping through that order like a stone and then had to retire because of overheating, I think, in the engine. So yeah, in that race he also got super testy with Lewis over the radios. So watch those two next year. I think if the Mercedes is good, there could be fireworks. George's strengths are that he's on Lewis's level when it comes to qualifying, and he has the pace to put in a good performance, but this year just never really had one really outstanding performance. And George is also generally fairly consistent, but it's at a lower level of consistent than Lewis. George's weaknesses is that he honestly has bottled more good results lately than Charles, which, like, British bias, guys, like, no one ever talks about how much George throws away races. And everyone's like, oh, Charles Leclerc always bottles race wins. But he's only really done it like maybe once or twice, whereas George has done it Singapore. He's like constantly taking people out lap one. Like, doesn't get enough crap for stuff like that. So yeah, keeping my eye on you, Georgie. And yeah, just his race pace this year wasn't there compared to Lewis. So something he needs to improve on, especially if the Mercedes gets better. In comparison to his teammate, he lacks the ability to always put in good results. I think he can be a little bit more peaky than Lewis. He's consistently at a worse level race-wise, but qualifying-wise, he managed to match Lewis. So, okay, next up, we've got the Aston Martin guys. And Fernando Alonso is going in standout just ahead of Lewis. For me, the reason why I have Fernando ahead of Lewis is just that I think Fernando didn't really have any bad races this year. He had a few races where he wasn't as good as normal, but he never had like a truly bad performance. And I think for that reason, he is a little bit ahead of Lewis. And also the fact that he was able to do this in the fifth best car, compared to the second best car is quite impressive. But yeah, Fernando started the year off incredibly strong and then finished the year quite well, but the middle section was a bit off, but that was more so because of the car kind of getting away from them than anything else. The fact that he managed to finish P4 in a car that was P5 in the constructors was very impressive. Fernando's best races for me were Bahrain, where he made some incredible overtakes and really put his mark down on how good he was going to be in that car, and it set the standard for him and that team. Monaco, where he qualified incredibly well, and without the Sector 3 of Max's life, would have gone on pole there and then probably would have been able to win the race. But he also probably could have won the race if not for one wrong tire call by his team. So sometimes it's like that. You gotta be perfect to beat Red Bull at this point. And then Brazil as well. His defending and then his last lap overtake on Checo were just incredible. Probably one of my favorite moments of the year. It was so fun to watch, and Fernando's just proving that age is just a number. He's been so good this year. His worst races, though, I would say Spain. He took damage in qualifying because of a mistake and still finished P7 in the race, but it was one of the few races this year that he finished behind Lance. So you got to kind of knock him for that. And then Singapore as well. I think it was his only race where he finished outside the points in a race he didn't DNF. But I did rewatch highlights from this race, and it was primarily because of the fact that his team had a horrendous pit stop under the VSC and dropped him from like P7 to last, essentially. So it wasn't really his fault, but it was the only race that he didn't finish in the points. So Fernando's strength is that he always outperforms the car he's driving. I don't think there has been a year where Fernando has underperformed the car. He's just always bringing it to places that it doesn't belong. And he does that with just incredible racecraft that cannot be beaten by anyone on the grid, really. He's just such an intelligent driver and knows where to place his car to stop people from passing him and where to place his car when he needs to pass someone else. He's just so good at it. His weaknesses, I think he has a few tracks that he just isn't that good at. I think Spain is one and Austria is the other. Not really sure why. Maybe it's just his driving style, but it just seems like there's some tracks where he isn't as able to get as much out of himself in the car as usual. And sometimes he's just too spiteful for his own good sometimes. But yeah, compared to his teammate Lance, he just completely destroyed Lance to the point where everyone was questioning, why is Lance still in F1? And also questioning Lawrence Stroll's commitment to winning, because that team had two good drivers in it this year. They would have finished a lot higher than P5, and Lance definitely let them down. So yes, Lance Stroll I have in mid ahead of the two Alfa Romeos. I probably would have had him much lower, probably in bad behind Checo Perez, but at the very end of the year he managed to turn it around just enough where I'm like, okay, I'll put you in mid. I think Lance seems to perform well when the car is good, but when the car isn't good, he just isn't able to get anything out of it. And that mainly comes in qualifying. He has just never been a good driver in qualifying. It just consistently lets him down, because if you look at him in the races, I was looking at a stat today, he was actually the second best driver this year at making up positions in races. And I think part of this is just that since he qualifies below what the car is capable of, he's able to bring it up in the races. And he is a good driver in the race. It's something I've said it a lot, like his biggest strength is his race starts. He knows where to place the car to make up positions and not get into trouble. And he's good at bringing that car up through the race. But if he was able to qualify better, he would be a much better driver, but he's just not. And so he's always able to make up positions, but if you're starting from P16 and you're only able to make up 5 positions, you're still not getting in the points. So even if he was just good enough to qualify in that like P11 to P13 range, I think he would be able to get a lot more points, but it's just the fact that he's getting kicked out in Q1 in a good car. It's like, what are you doing, buddy? You got to be better than that. But yes, towards the end of the year, he was able to qualify better, and then he was able to get those P5, P6 finishes that he should have been getting all year. So he's just a very frustrating driver for me. But yeah, I will say, I think a big reason why I have him down in mid is that he just wasn't able to do what Fernando was able to do in that car. And I think if he was, that Aston Martin would have been able to definitely get P4, but I think probably should have maybe even gotten P3 this year. So it's just unfortunate that Lance wasn't able to get very much out of the car. His best races this year, I think number 1 for me was Bahrain at the start of the year. When he finished P6 with 2 broken wrists, I think that was when everyone kind of stopped saying that Lance wasn't committed to F1. I think that kind of crept back at the end of the year again, but I think Lance had an excuse to not be in the car that weekend, but he didn't take it. And I think everyone gained a lot of respect for him battling through that in that race. Who knows how much that impacted him for the rest of the year? I'd be curious to know about that, but I think it was very impressive at the time. Brazil was also a very good race for him. He qualified well for once, and because of that he finished P5, which, like I was saying, if he can qualify well, his racecraft is good enough that he should be able to finish in the points, but he's just not qualifying well enough. And then Vegas, again, qualified P19 and managed to get up to P5. Mainly that was because of all the chaos of the first lap, but sort out your qualifying, Lance. And then his worst races, Monaco. Monaco was really bad. He had very poor driving in the wet conditions, which used to be something that Lance was kind of labeled as being good at. And in this race, very bad. Crashed into the wall a couple times, went straight on into a runoff, came back onto the track in an unsafe manner, and then Checo ran into George as a result. That was chaos. And then Qatar he just threw a tantrum. That's what happened in that race. He threw a tantrum and more than likely pushed his trainer, which I understand you're frustrated, but don't take it out on another human being who is just trying to help you. It's not a good look. So, yeah, not a good look for him. But yeah, he qualified poorly and then he raced even poorer. Although he was passing out in the car on the corners. But yes, his strengths, race starts, and just the race in general. He is good at staying out of trouble and manages to place his car in places to make up positions at the start. But yes, his weaknesses, qualifying, only good when the car is good, and often seems to lack motivation. But yeah, Fernando just completely obliterated him, and the only times he really beat him was when Fernando's car had damage or the team made a mistake. Okay, next up we have Oscar Piastri. And I hummed and hawed with Oscar, but for me, I think I'm going to put him in good ahead of Carlos Sainz. Oscar had a truly incredible rookie year. He didn't make too many big mistakes. The only one I can really think of is him crashing and qualifying in Canada. There were some races where he's able to be on Lando's level, especially in the first few races when that McLaren car got good. He won that sprint race in Qatar, and then Lando just flipped a switch and Oscar was no longer near Lando in terms of pace. So I think Lando got kicked into high gear because of that. And I think he was also going to tracks that he wasn't as familiar with, and that might have cost him as well. I will say though that Oscar does have a lot to learn in terms of tire management, and once he figures that out, I think he will be a very powerful driver, and I'm very curious to see where his career goes from here. But yeah, his best races, definitely Qatar in both the sprint and in the GP. He beat Lando to his first career win in F1 with that sprint race win. And he also finished P2 ahead of Lando in the race. It was easily his best weekend of the year. And yeah, to outperform Lando at that race was very impressive. Britain, he also did very well. He would have finished on the podium there if not for a safety car. Japan, he also finished on the podium, but that weekend he was a bit off of Lando's pace, mainly due to the tires. And then Singapore was also a good race from him, where he went from P17 to P7. Oscar's worst races, definitely Belgium. I think he was a little bit too aggressive on that turn one, although Carlos should take most of the blame with that collision for locking up, avoiding Lewis, and as a result going into Oscar. But yeah, just that was kind of self-inflicted there. I think a bit of a risky move. Austria was also a bit of a rough one for him. Lando managed to finish P4 at that race and Oscar finished P16, although I think a lot of that difference was down to the car upgrades that were brought for Lando's car in that race and not Oscar's. So who knows where he would have finished if he also had those upgrades. I think Lando was also just an absolute god at Austria, and so it's not entirely Oscar's fault there. And then Monza was also a bit of a rough one for him. He collided with both Oscar and Lewis, although the Lewis one was more so Lewis's fault. But Monza was kind of the only race where it seemed like he kind of lost his cool a little bit for having been asked, I think, to move out of the way of his teammate. And then, or maybe it wasn't that he was asked to move out of the way, or the fact that he got undercut by his teammate and it was trying to get back past him and then collided with him. McLaren were not very happy about that. His strengths are that he was able to put pressure on Lando, especially when he initially got the updates. And he is just so emotionally mature and keeps calm under pressure. I think he's much better at this than a lot of drivers on the grid. And for a rookie, I think that's very impressive. And when the car was good, he performed. He didn't make mistakes in qualifying like someone else in an orange car. And then his weaknesses, definitely tire management. I think a lack of experience with most of the tracks as a rookie was something that cost him in this season. So I'm sure he'll improve next season because of that. And he can be a bit too passive sometimes when it comes to overtaking and defending. I think if he stuck his elbows out a little bit more, I think he would have held on to or been able to make up a few more positions. Compared to his teammate, he was fairly close in some races, but once Oscar won that sprint race in Qatar, it lit a fire under Lando's ass, and Lando outperformed him from then on. Speaking of Lando, I have him in standout just behind Fernando and Lewis. I think it's truly a toss-up between those three. The reason why I have Lando behind Fernando and Lewis is just that Lando kept making massive mistakes in qualifying sessions when the car was good. When he knew that he could put it on pole, or when he knew he could be on for a very good result in the race, he kept pushing it a little bit too hard in qualifying and getting caught out on track limits or having a big moment, and it just cost him so much. The races that I think of for this were Qatar, where he qualified P10 because of track limits when he should have been probably on pole or at least front row, as well as Abu Dhabi. He had that very big moment qualifying and probably should have qualified higher up than he did. But yeah, I actually do have Qatar as one of his worst races, even though he finished on the podium in both the sprint and the race itself. He was outperformed by Oscar that weekend, and the mistakes that he made just cost him big time at that race when he probably could have been on for a win. And so Lando needs to cut those out of his MO if he wants to be a championship winning driver. And he's got to figure it out quick, because I think the longer it goes on that Lando isn't able to get that first win, I think the more it's going to get in his head and the bigger problem it's going to become in terms of getting over it. Because we've kind of seen that with Hulkenberg, where every single time Hulkenberg seems to be on for a potential podium, he always seems to make a mistake. And it's like, you can't let that creep into your psyche if you want to be a championship winning driver. Lando's best races, though, were Britain, where he managed to get ahead of Max at the start and lead his home Grand Prix, which I'm sure was very exciting for him, and managed to finish on the podium. Also Austria, where he managed to finish P4. And even with a car that was only partially upgraded, he was still able to do that, which was very impressive. And then Japan as well. He qualified very well there and raced well. And that was a race where he did outperform Piastri, especially in terms of tire management. So as mentioned, Qatar was one of his worst races. Another bad race for Lando was Spain, where he qualified very well in a car that probably shouldn't have been high up as it was in that race, but then accidentally clipped his front wing on lap 1 and tumbled all the way to the back and ended up finishing P17, which in a wild stat was actually his second most common race result in 2023. Number 1 most common was P2, where I think he had 6 P2s, and number 2, P17, where he had 4 finishes. What a wild spread. Very strange stat. So yes, Lando's strengths, he's very good at keeping out of trouble in races usually. He rarely gets damaged, rarely has a crash, rarely has a moment. He's very good at keeping it on in the limits. He's also usually a very strong qualifier, except for in moments where he knows the car is good, expectations are high, and he screws it up and he just pushes that extra percentage point too far, and he needs to rein that back in a little bit and allow himself to accept that P2 as a starting position instead of falling back to P10 with track limits issues. And also Lando needs to kind of sort out his motivation, because it seemed like at the start of the year when the car was bad, he didn't have much motivation, but then even once the car got good, Oscar was still on his level. But I think he had that motivating factor of Oscar getting to that race win, and then that kicked him into high gear. So he needs to be in that high gear all year if he wants to win a championship. So he needs to be able to turn that on right away. But yeah, compared to his teammate, he outperformed him in qualifying and had much better race pace, mainly due to knowing how to manage his tires. But I think Oscar did seem to outperform him in high pressure situations on tracks where that car was good for the most part, but only really in qualifying. Once the race came around, even if Lando had qualified below Oscar, I'd still pass him in the race eventually, but I think he would have done a lot better if he had qualified higher. And finally, our number 1 driver of the year. Is it really any surprise? It's Max Verstappen. If anyone doesn't have him as the best driver of the year, they are completely delulu. I don't know what else to say. Y'all know I am a Max hater. But even I know when to respect someone for their talent, and Max just had an incredible season. He was completely unstoppable, and he won every single race this year except 3. And set way too many records to count, and took a record away from Seb, which hurt me in my heart. But Seb will still always be the youngest driver champion, and so that I can still take solace in. But yes, Max's best races. Honestly, probably all of them except Singapore, but there were a few in particular that really stood out for me. I think Miami is one of them, and it's mainly because Max said it himself that this was the race where he knew that he was going to win the championship, because he was able to come back from a P9 qualifying position to beat Checo, who qualified first. And that race completely destroyed Checo's confidence and completely inflated Max's. And there was just no coming back from that for Checo. Monaco as well. Honestly, I think Max's pole lap in Monaco was probably my favorite moment of the year. I was very disappointed in the moment, but looking back on that, I am just floored by that performance. It was truly incredible, and even though he took it away from Fernando, how many tenths he took back in that final sector was insane, and he fully deserved that win that weekend because of that pole lap. And it pains me to say it, but it was just so incredible to watch. And then my other stand-up performance for him was the Dutch GP, because with the amount of chaos caused by the rain in that race, in most years that would be the race where the dominant car would manage to find a way to not win it. But Red Bull and Max are just so powerful that even through all that chaos, they still managed to win. They didn't make it their Hockenheim 2019, probably also because Max won Hockenheim 2019, so he knows what he's doing in those kind of conditions. And his worst races, obviously you got to put Singapore on here, but honestly was mainly down to his team and the setup than anything else. And the fact that this was the only race all season that he didn't podium is wild. Even the sprint races, that man was on a complete other level. And I don't know if it'll ever be topped. And then Baku as well. I think I would say that's the only race this year where he was outperformed by Checo. And honestly, given the car Charles was in, I think Charles outperformed him as well. But yeah, once I think I heard that after that race, he went back to factory and really sat down and figured out a setup that would work for him. And then after that, he was unbeatable. So I think it was almost a good thing that that happened for him. Max's strengths, literally everything. He is the best driver in the wet. He's the most aggressive driver. He has very quick pace in qualifying. I wouldn't necessarily say the best, but he has very quick pace in qualifying. He has probably the quickest race pace. He's the best in the best team in terms of strategy. He's in the best team in terms of pit stops. Although maybe second best now thanks to McLaren's 1.8 second pit stop, but it's very debatable between those two teams. And then he also has the best team in car design because of Adrian Newey. So those last 3 aren't really Max, but still, there is no weakness. What is the weakness? I do not know. 0 weaknesses there. But if I did have to say one, and I've said this before, is if you are able to get in his head and under his skin, he might lose his cool and then get too aggressive. And when he gets too aggressive, he goes for moves that aren't there, and then he gets damage. I am very, very curious to see what happens if someone else can get back on Max's level, because I think if we can put Max under a little bit more pressure than he's been under, maybe we will see him not be as dominant as he has been this year, because no one was able to put him under pressure, and so no one was able to get under his skin. And I'm just, things are looking a little bit better for next year, and I'm really, really hoping that the teams don't screw it up. But I think Red Bull also has the chance to really make a huge step themselves, and so I don't know. As you can probably tell, I've been very unmotivated at the end of this year. I've been putting out videos a week after I should be, and it hasn't been very good for growing my follower count. But the big reason for that is just that F1 isn't as fun when there isn't competition. And I'm really hoping that comes back next year. I really need it. I think if there was another season like this one, I might have to put a pause on this channel for a little bit until things kind of turn around again, because I don't want to burn myself out doing this when I'm not enjoying it. But yeah, here's to Max having the most dominant season in F1 history. I applaud you for your talent and your efforts, sir. Please never do it again. I think a lot of the F1 world would appreciate that. But if you do manage to do it again, all the more to you. I will be complaining the entire time. And I'm sorry, but it is true. And yeah. So overall, here is my list of drivers from 1st to 20th in terms of how they did this season. I think the biggest movers, Tsunoda was up 11 places from the start of this year, and then Albon and Piastri made up a lot, as well as Hülkenberg. Biggest droppers, definitely Perez, who is lucky to still have a seat, honestly. That's kind of how I'm feeling about it. And Magnussen as well really dropped, but I think that was partially the Haas's fault, and Russell really dropped as well. I think he just didn't really have a very impressive season. Now, it'll be very interesting to see how I rank them going into next year, because there is no changes from this list for the 2024 F1 drivers. So I think how I rank them as drivers is different than this, but then how a season goes does change their ranking. So it'll probably be a clean slate going into next year, and things will move around a little bit. I think Tsunoda was a big one for me. He really improved his stock for me this year. So yeah. So that's the end of this video. Give a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. I'm going to try to put out more content in the off season, but as I have said, I have been woefully unmotivated lately. And as soon as I promise what videos will be out, I no longer make those videos. So that's ADHD for you. Sometimes you can't win. Let me know what your rankings were in the comments down below, and I hope you enjoy the holiday season if you don't hear from me again. Toodaloos.